Hello, good morning, good afternoon for those who have joined us, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Understanding Patient Access Programs and Their Strategic Utility During Pre- or Post-Market Clinical Trials. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. My name is Caitlin McNally and I am Conference Director and MedTech Lead here at LSX, based in London. And I am delighted to be hosting you today on this webinar, the next in our MedTech Innovation Series in partnership with MICRA. We have some join us today who are familiar with LSX, but for those who are not, I wanted to briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, big medtech and pharma companies. The full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers and providers and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. As well as virtual and digital content like this, many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in Europe and US, including our LSX World, USA, and Nordic Congresses, which connect our community throughout the year for educating, partnering, and networking. We're delighted to be working with MICRA again for today's session and indeed this webinar series. As a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance, they are perfect partners for this series. Today, you're going to hear from Daria Harlan-Schumann, who is the Senior Director at MICRA, and Alicia Polk, who is Senior Director of Patient Access Program Solutions and Operations at MICRA. I'd like to ensure that we give a minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to the MICRA team, who will be guiding us through today's session. So just a couple of quick points to mention from me before we kick off today. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for me to put any questions you may have to the MICRA team. I would encourage you all to please make sure you use this time to ask any questions or follow-ups from the presentation. Please ask your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many as we can after. Please, you'll see the Q&A function just at the bottom, and we prefer if you use that rather than the chat function for your questions. If you do see a question that you wanted to ask in the Q&A section already, you can upvote that question to show that you're also interested in the answer, and we'll look to address those first. So please do use this function and ask any questions you have at that point throughout the session. And so that is it for me, and I'd like to now hand over to Daria from MICRA.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As Caitlin said, I'm Daria Schumann. I'm going to be presenting this webinar today with my colleague, Alicia. Today, we're going to be talking about patient access solutions and specifically patient access programs in the context of clinical trials. I think in its simplest form, when we think about patient access programs and case-by-case coverage, working through that health plan process, the reality is a lot of people think about this in the context of post-commercialization, when your product's already on the market. But today we're going to be talking about use during a clinical trial with a heavy focus on pre-market and why you might pursue that option as a company running a trial. So let's just start with some brief intros. I'm Daria, I am the Senior Director, as Caitlin mentioned. I've been with MICRA 11 years this past August. Prior to joining MICRA, I worked at a law firm. I have a legal background. I also worked at a nonprofit, so I have a legal and policy background. In terms of day-to-day at MICRA, I work very closely with our CRO to negotiate contracts and budgets between study sponsors and our clinical trial sites, so the doctors and the institutions. But I also, given my reimbursement background, I focus on clinical trial reimbursement, not surprisingly, I guess. So I help sponsors understand and navigate pathways for coverage and payment during a clinical trial specifically. And that, of course, is going to be part of what we're talking about today. Alicia, would you like to give a brief intro?
Sure, thanks, Daria. So hi, everyone. My name's Alicia Polk. I've been with MICRA since November of last year, so just about 11 months. I've brought to MICRA just over 20 years of experience within revenue cycle, all the way from order to cash. I have a lot of experience in healthcare operations, as well as business process improvement. My role as Senior Director of Patient Access Solutions and Operations here at MICRA is to offer new and novel medtech companies the opportunity to utilize patient access solutions and/or programming to experience reimbursement for their providers. So we'll be focusing on patient access today, but specifically as it relates to setting up a solution and/or program, as Daria alluded to, for your clinical trial. Thanks, Daria.
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. So Caitlin gave a nice overview of MICRA, and some of you on the line may know who we are, but for those who don't, we consider ourselves a boutique consulting firm, specializing in regulatory, reimbursement, clinical. We have a full service CRO, quality assurance and manufacturing, and compliance. We got our start in the spine and ortho space, but more recently, really the last 5 to 7 years, we've hired a ton of experts in other anatomies so as to increase our knowledge base and essentially become experts in these other anatomies, most specifically cardio, neuro, and IBD. So that's just a little bit about MICRA and who we are. In terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be starting with an introduction to reimbursement planning during clinical trials. So just in its most basic form, what that looks like, what you have to consider. And then Alicia is going to be walking through the different components of patient access solutions and more specifically, a patient access program. Then we'll segue into strategic considerations. Why would you use a PAP, a patient access program, during a clinical trial? When does it make sense to do so? And then finally, we'll close with some real world examples based on our combined experience. And of course, we'll entertain questions at the end, as Caitlin said. So let's start with this notion of reimbursement planning during a clinical trial. I always like to start with some content like this that really makes the point that the reimbursement considerations should and do occur throughout the product life cycle. And the earlier you can be planning for reimbursement, the better. And as a company, we MICRA have service offerings throughout the product life cycle, but this early strategic planning before even perhaps before you've even started your clinical trial involves things like understanding the landscape for your technology, understanding the market for your technology. What does coding, coverage, and payment look like? What long-term do we need to be thinking about? It's sort of strategizing early. And then of course, what happens during your trial? And these don't exist in silos. They all interrelate and they inform each other. And that's a theme you're going to hear a lot today. But the focus of today's webinar is going to be on what's sort of in the middle here, clinical trial reimbursement. So during your trial, pursuing coverage, submitting to payers, educating your sites on how to do this. There's a whole host of service offerings available to help a sponsor pursue coverage during a trial. But of course, we're going to be really honing in on that bolded one there, patient access programs, and why you'd be using that. And then of course, after you're on the market, in a perfect world, everything's smooth, but the reality is that sometimes there are challenges. And as a company, you may need to be executing on that strategy you've built. You may need to be setting up hotlines or call centers or patient access programs post-commercialization. You may need to be developing materials for your field staff. So the takeaway here is really, it's important throughout the product lifecycle. Our focus today is going to be on this central part of the arrow, but this doesn't exist in a silo. Each piece informs. So you may hear me use the term CTRS, Clinical Trial Reimbursement Solutions. That's what it stands for. And at its most basic, it really just refers to this idea of coding, coverage, and payment during your trial. We do a lot of IDE, investigational device. We do a lot of IND, a lot of pre-market work. But these points we're making today can still be applied in a post-approval trial. When we look at CTRS and evaluate the need to plan for that during your trial, we go back to the basics. What does coding, coverage, and payment look like for your technology? Does it make sense for you as a company running a trial to pursue coverage coding and reimbursement, to ask your sites to bill insurance and try to get claims covered. And that's the answer to that is sometimes no, maybe it doesn't make sense. And we're going to talk about that and that strategic thinking that we can help support. So just to sort of, high level look at how we as a company evaluate this issue, because we do run a lot of trials and we have a lot of companies coming to us planning to run a trial. And as I said, it doesn't make sense for all of them to pursue clinical trial support or a PAP, a patient access program, during the trial. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And part of, I think one of the benefits of MICRA is we can help you look at the big picture and understand whether it makes sense to pursue any of these services, and more specifically, a patient access program. So just to give you some examples, here's the types of things we ask when someone comes to us and they're running a trial and they want to evaluate whether it would be beneficial for them to bill insurance during their trial. Is there a code? You hear that a lot in reimbursement. Is there a code? Do we have a code? Can we use this code? Very important. Is there a way to report this procedure? What does coverage look like outside of a trial? Because clinical trial coverage is a whole separate animal, but understanding what the technology coverage landscape looks like outside of a trial is really important to making a decision about asking your sites to then bill during the clinical trial. Study design, huge. I'll talk about that in a second here. Do you want to ask your sites to bill insurance? Some sponsors want to run a trial, get enrollment as quickly as possible, pay for everything. Maybe it's a single arm trial. And that's a factor too. It's a financial or business decision. We factor that in too. And lastly, what does the market look like? Is there even a market yet? Maybe it's so novel that there isn't. But these are the types of questions we ask, and we ask of our sponsors, and we collaborate to reach a decision that makes sense. Study design considerations, very big deal. It's amazing how something like the randomization timing can be so critical to this decision making. And again, I think that's where we really do have our expertise. I've worked on trials where the patient's randomized in the OR, and for a site to understand that and to understand how to pre-authorize that beforehand, if it's a randomized trial and there's two different arms, I think is a lot to ask. And so we can help support that, help sites understand how to do that, help take that burden away from the site if a company pursues a patient access program. So, the takeaway here is really your technology landscape is important, and your study design, all of these different aspects of how you're running your study, what the control is, is it blinded, a whole nother nuance that can complicate things. But that big picture is something we as a team evaluate to help you make the best decision for how to proceed and whether to pursue a patient access program. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia to dive in a little more into what that program might look like.
Thanks, Daria. So because a patient access program, as Daria alluded, is not a one-size-fits-all approach, at MICRA, we look at patient access truly as an opportunity to provide our clients, essentially in this case, our CTRS clients, an alternative solution to not only getting patients access to the technology itself, but also an opportunity to assist the trial site providers with an opportunity to experience reimbursement on a case-by-case basis during their clinical trial. Next slide, Daria. So the clients who typically benefit from a patient access solution during a clinical trial, such as maybe consultative advice or a customized revenue cycle support approach, or an actual patient access program, are typically those medtech companies seeking reimbursement either pre-market or post-market during their clinical trial. It's that simple, which is something that can be identified during the trial planning, as Daria also spoke to, as a part of their overall market and reimbursement strategy planning. Next slide, Daria. Next slide. So ensuring that you design a patient access solution that makes sense during your clinical trial is something that is extremely important because a full-blown patient access program may or may not be beneficial to you. So making sure that you have a business partner that can offer you the opportunity to be flexible while designing reimbursement or your reimbursement strategy during your clinical trial is something that you should be looking for when you're considering pursuing reimbursement during the trial. Next slide. So if you do decide to pursue a full-blown patient access program during your clinical trial, that program at minimum should include a robust coding assessment. So Darius spoke to the coding and the importance of the coding. This allows you to validate the codes you are using during the clinical trial will potentially provide the highest level of reimbursement for your trial site providers. You should also consider doing a coding validation or creating a reimbursement guide. This can serve as the foundation for your program itself. The program should also come with a custom 800 line or custom email, some type of telephony infrastructure for your field staff, providers, and/or patients to reach out to obtain general coding inquiries, understand reimbursement construct as it relates to your technology. You should also have access to certified coders. The program itself should give you access to not only the ability to answer those generalized coding questions, but really do a deep dive in situations where there's true complexity or ambiguity around the codes that you're using or planning to bill with during your trial. You should also have a partner or the ability within your program to assist the providers by, again, taking that heavy lifting away by conducting the benefit verifications, prior authorizations, and/or appeals on behalf of your site providers. If the program is robust enough, it should also provide a portal for the manufacturer to be able to check the health and status of their program real time during the trial. And the portal should also offer the ability for providers to submit cases as well as check the status of those cases that they submit during the trial. Reporting and periodic touch points for your program during the trial is important. You may want to pivot or make some adjustments to your patient access program strategy. So having that flexibility during the trial is also important. Access to payer engagement and evidence resources. So as decisions are coming back on your claims, primarily negative decisions, having the ability to look at the payer, look at those negative policies and/or your evidence during the trial is also important to consider when you're launching a patient access program. And lastly, compliance, making sure that your program is wholly compliant during the clinical trial, or if you decide to continue with your patient access program post-market. Again, that compliance component is extremely important. Next slide, Daria. So lastly, another important piece to consider if you are planning to set up a patient access program while conducting a clinical trial is the data richness. So the data components that you decide during your trial planning to collect as part of your patient access program really are really important. This data is collected along the way to help you mitigate negative medical policies, also help you understand the strength of the evidence and the data that you have to support medical necessity for your technology. It also assists you later down the road when you're pursuing a Category 1 code, or if you're deciding to expand upon your reimbursement strategy. Having a sound repository of data that is collected on a case-by-case basis for your patient access program is very important. So having that said, I'll turn it back over to Daria to dig into the strategic considerations and how, again, utilizing a patient access program during your trial could be beneficial.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. And something you said resonated with me. So often I work with sponsors on trials where they're not using a patient access program, but they are asking their sites to bill insurance. And you mentioned the need for that resource of being able to pick up the phone and call and ask about a code, or ask how something gets reported, or ask about bundling. That is so critical. Oftentimes when a manufacturer sponsor doesn't have that, those questions get funneled to the wrong people and the site is left scrambling. And patients are being scheduled for surgeries and surgeries are being pushed because there's not an answer on the reimbursement question. Who's going to pay for this? And that's an important question. And so I think that in and of itself, it just highlights the need to have that singular resource so that your sites know they can pick up the phone and call and get an answer that's specific to the technology and the trial.
Absolutely.
It did resonate with me. So thank you.
Yeah, it's critical. Thank you.
Sure. So strategic considerations, we talked sort of high level about whether to pursue coverage during a clinical trial, whether to, ask your sites to bill, ask your sites to submit claims to a health plan. A step further beyond that is, would it be beneficial to utilize a patient access program, which Alicia just sort of explained the model program, what it should include, and depending on the robustness that you select as a company. A patient access program may not make sense even when you're asking your sites to bill, but very often it does. And the key here is that it often and should serve your longer term reimbursement needs. And those needs can look different. And that's where understanding the big picture of your technology, what its market access strategy is, what the landscape looks like, that's where that understanding becomes so critical to your decision about whether to use a patient access program. And if I ask you a question, what's your code? Do you have a code? And you don't know the answer to that, that's fine. That just means perhaps we can support you through that as well, understanding that landscape. So there's a variety of ways that utilizing a patient access program or patient access solutions during a trial can support your long-term reimbursement needs. It's going to be specific to your technology, your industry, but here's a few examples just to kind of go through them. It establishes early payer adopters. So very often these are investigational technologies, but submitting claims to either private health plans like your Aetnas and your Cignas, or to Medicare, gives you intel as to who the payer adopters are, and on the flip side, where you're getting coverage denials, so that you as a company, post-commercialization, can develop a payer education, payer stakeholder strategy that makes sense and that aligns with what you've seen during the trial. If Aetna's covering you, but Cigna isn't, you can focus your resources appropriately so that you're sending the right educational materials to the payers who might need to see it. A second example is precedence for coverage adoption criteria. What this basically means is, your protocol has inclusion-exclusion criteria, and through submitting claims to health plans, you're helping shape those coverage criteria that eventually get written into a medical policy. All of those diagnosis codes that go on the claim form, they matter. They're going to help shape whether and when the health plan is going to cover your technology post-commercialization or incorporate it into a medical policy or even create a new medical policy. So attention to those inclusion-exclusion criteria is really key. And in some ways, especially if you, well, maybe not especially, but if you have a technology that is similar to something else on the market, trying to align that so that any coverage policies that do exist would cover your technology that's trying to get onto the market. A third example, and something Alicia actually spoke to when she was going through some of the data, is this notion of tracking volume or utilization. That, if coding is a challenge for your product and you're going to need to pursue a new permanent CPT code, for example, tracking code utilization is key, and tracking volume is something that you will absolutely need when you eventually go to apply for a permanent CPT code. So you see here it says category 3 CPT coding, tracking volume, and tracking volume through claim submission tends to be viewed more favorably by the CPT editorial panel. It's not the only way to track volume, but I think it is viewed as sort of the gold standard. And these are examples here, just to pause for a second, obviously may not all apply, but in some instances more than one does apply. So even more reason, I think, to pursue a patient access program depending on your scenario. Claims data set population. So that refers to, again, this notion that the claims are going in, they're going to health plans, and that health plan is, has a record of that case, of those codes in their claims database. And that can be really critical, especially on the Medicare front, to serve some longer term needs. So as an example, perhaps payment's insufficient, or perhaps you're mapped to an APC that doesn't pay sufficiently. So, there are mechanisms for seeking additional payment post-commercialization. And very often those applications will require evidence of utilization and evidence that claims are going through the system. Now, I said especially Medicare here because that's sort of the most transparent example, and they have things like the TPT, transitional pass-through application, new technology APC. Those sort of applications and initiatives are what I'm referring to here. And a key piece of those is very often Medicare going and looking in their own claims database to see how often the procedure was reported and what charges were reported. So if you have a technology with insufficient payment, it may be beneficial to, during your clinical trial, have your sites bill and sort of build that, case so that when you go to apply for additional payment post-commercialization, you have all that documentation and evidence to support your case. And last on this list, it can be as simple as prospective economic data collection. A patient access program allows you to collect data via electronic claim forms, in real time, and that is very valuable intel. So, I'm going to segue into that in a second and kind of give a more drilled down example. But the point really, again, is this, these are just a few reasons. They're probably some of the most popular reasons that a company might pursue a patient access program. And in some instances, there's more than one of these going on for your technology. Maybe you don't have a code and no one's covering it. You could be facing multiple challenges, but we can help you look at that and understand how to combat that, how to strategize and improve that situation. So I'm sort of piggybacking off of this last bullet here, prospective economic data collection. And I do want to say, Alicia reminded me, I have a paper form here. Very few payers are using, very few hospitals are using paper forms anymore, but this is just for example purposes only. I think this is important because it shows the capabilities of a patient access program, but it really also highlights how important this data is that you could be collecting as a sponsor. And so, when I said at the end of my last slide, prospective economic data collection, that's a lot of really great intel here. And a patient access program, if you're trying to collect this after you've run your trial, you're trying to go back to hospitals to see what they charged, that can be not only a big headache, to be frank, but it tends to be, that sort of retrospective data collection versus prospective tends to be viewed less favorably by reimbursement stakeholders. Everyone likes prospective data collection. A patient access program, citing to the example Alicia walked through, ideally and should be collecting this data for you from your sites in real time, in the form of a proprietary database and some method for taking the information that's on that claim form, that electronic form, and inputting it into a database in a usable format. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to read your own claim form or your own EOB, it can be complex and confusing. And having all of that intel stored and then analyzed is really critical and takes a lot of burden off your sites, off you as a sponsor, and can be used for a variety of different ways. So I think one of the first things, obviously, collecting that data shows you the codes used by the providers. And ideally, if you're getting EOBs, well, before we even get there, what place of service, what are the billed charges, and then on the flip side, what are the allowed amounts, who's paying, who's denying. Similarly to what I discussed earlier, it identifies early payer adopters. But on the flip side of that, it's identifying who's denying and why. Understanding the denial reason, that in and of itself can be really pertinent. Is it just being denied because it's a clinical trial? Let's fight that. Is it being denied because it's experimental, investigational? It depends. And that will help you build, your evidence base. It will help you build your strategy for when you're going out to health plans post-commercialization. And all of this is obviously great information to have, and I think gives you great intel, but it also can support a future health economic analysis. So, as a company, perhaps you want to talk, you're going to issue publications not just about the clinical effectiveness of your technology, but more recently, cost effectiveness is something that stakeholders do care about. And so being able to look at prospectively collected data and make a health economic argument, right, publish in a journal about the cost effectiveness of your product can also be really, really critical. So those are just some examples of the strategic reasons and the strategic questions you should be asking if you're considering pursuing a patient access program. I want to transition to give you a few examples, because I think it really does highlight what we just talked about, that it's the big picture that matters here. So my first example here is obviously these are companies running clinical trials. This first one is a second generation cardio technology. So sort of like a second iteration of a device that was approved, commercially available, but that, this design change required by FDA additional study and an additional human subject study. So this company was asked to run a clinical trial. There was existing coding to report the procedure, which is great. There was also coverage outside of a trial, so by both Medicare and private plans. So this company, sounds like they're in a great situation. However, payment was insufficient for the facility. So the facility who was purchasing the device and billing insurance was getting insufficient payment. Additionally, as way of background, this manufacturer did have really good relationships with sites and hospitals from having conducted prior research with many of them. So I think that's an important point to make. But you look at this situation, we've got coding and we've got coverage, but payment is insufficient. So, there's no need to track a code, there's no need to establish payer adopters, but we need to do something about this insufficient payment to facilities, because long-term, that's not a viable or sustainable path forward if facilities are losing money when they're purchasing a company's product. And the solution here was really, they used a patient access program during the trial. They had good relationships with their facilities. They sort of explained the long-term strategy here. Listen, like, we're going to ask you to bill. We understand that there's financial implications, but we're doing this because long-term we are going to make an argument for increased payment once this device is commercialized. And again, if you recall back to one of my earlier slides, in order to do that with Medicare, very often they need to see data in the claims database. So they use the trial to populate the claims database appropriately and bill appropriately, and then went through the steps of submitting for additional payment. I can't remember if it was TP, transitional pass-through, or new technology add-on. But the point is, they were successful in going through Medicare to get that additional payment. And a huge piece of that was pointing to the claims that were generated during their clinical trial. Okay, so that's case study number one. Case study number two, and this is an example where a patient access program may not make sense. And I think, Alicia and I talked about this before giving this presentation, but I think it's important to see that it doesn't always make sense to pursue a program like this. And it doesn't always make sense to pursue reimbursement during a trial. So let's talk through this one briefly. This was a recent one, actually, a single arm IDE trial in evaluating a well-covered spine implant. Single arm is important here. So this technology has existing coding, it has existing coverage, and it does have sufficient payment, unlike the prior example. So facilities, providers, everyone's getting paid appropriately, no one's suffering a financial loss. The market, I will say, for this is pretty saturated. And again, a non-randomized trial with without an active control, so single arm. So, we're looking at we're talking to this company, we're trying to evaluate what should they do here. And basically, because there was no need for code tracking, no need to establish any sort of coverage precedents, no need to populate claims database, and because they wanted enrollment done quickly, we, as a collective group, decided that this sponsor would not bill insurance during their trial. The challenge that I identified was that they had a saturated market. So how do they distinguish their technology from other similar technologies that are commercially available? How do they go to a hospital and say you should buy our device instead of device ABC? So that was their challenge. It wasn't like a perfect slam dunk here. But coding coverage and payment was sufficient, and enrollment in clinical research recently, I think this is not a surprise, but it's been a challenge, in part because of the pandemic, but because of other factors as well. So this company made the decision to pay directly for everything. We advised against using a patient access program. We advised against using or pursuing coverage and reimbursement, period, as a way to help with enrollment. So there was direct sponsor pay, to be clear. But we still helped them find a way to collect important economic data, and that was through their CRFs. So through data entry and data required of the sites, they asked their sites when the patients came in and during the surgical visit, please collect data on complications at follow-up. Please report the CPT code. Please denote the setting of care, the OR time, the blood loss. We basically use the CRFs to collect economic data. So the sites were already going to be, collecting data. We just modified some of the CRFs that the sites were asked to complete, and we use that as a way to collect economic data. So that's an example where, we looked at the big picture. We identified a challenge, but we found a way to address that challenge that made sense and that met the client's larger needs. So sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. All right. That, folks, is it for the formal presentation. I think at this point, we are going to open it up for questions.
Yep, I will just quickly thank you very much, Daria and Alicia, for the presentation component of today's webinar. I will say it's not too late to ask questions. There is the Q&A function at the bottom of the toolbar of the screen. Feel free to ask away, but I will kick off by asking the first question that we have here. So we have, thanks for the presentation. I have a question. What makes a clinical trial patient access program different from a patient access program for a product that is commercially available? I'll leave it to Dara or Alicia to decide who would like to answer that one.
You want to go for it, Alicia?
Really, for me, it's the FDA approval component. So when the product or technology is considered commercialized, at that point, at least here at MICRA, we encompass that with the approval from the FDA as one of the components of launching a post-commercialization patient access program. But as we spoke to earlier in the presentation, you can launch a patient access program on a pre-market basis while you're still learning about your technology, the behavior of the technology, but in conjunction with learning about the payers and the landscape, as well as the behavior and how to really pull together a fully blown reimbursement strategy. Daria, anything to add to that?
The only thing I would add is, I think you're contending with clinical trial policies on top of technology specific coverage.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, no, and that's something, that sort of intersection between the clinical trial policy and what it says about clinical research does need to be factored into a clinical trial patient access program, but I think operationally, they are very much the same.
Brilliant. We have another question here. I have an upcoming trial starting next year. How can I learn more about executing a patient access program for this?
Oh, well, first and foremost, please reach out to MICRA. Daria and I are happy to spend time with you to walk you through more of a deeper dive session. We just really today did a kind of a glaze over of, the opportunities for thinking about patient access. We would do a deeper dive into the types of solutions, because again, we hate to like overstate, but a full-blown patient access program may or may not be right for you based on just where you are in the life cycle of your whole strategy relating to your product. So reach out to us, give us a call. Our contact information is listed here on this slide. We'd be happy to spend some time with you and talk about the strategy or where you're going with your trial.
Brilliant. Moving on to the next question. You may have mentioned this, but will we get access to the slides and a recording? And I can confirm we will be sending out the slides and recording to everybody who has attended today's webinar. So moving on to our next question, should I expect a ton of denials from insurance using a patient access program, or are health plans covering clinical trial services?
So the answer is it depends. It depends on your technology. It depends on what the disease state is, but just know that at this point, Medicare has a very transparent policy for covering what they call routine care costs during clinical research. So if you have a study that will treat elderly patients and you get approval from CMS, which is something I'm happy to talk about separately, for those who are interested, coverage from CMS is available and tends to be widespread. On the private payer side, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. Every private payer at this point does have a clinical trial policy. So a policy that specifically dictates what they do and do not cover during clinical research. Some of them are very similar to Medicare's and more progressive in what they cover. Others are much more limited. So that's why I say it depends. Depends on patient mix, meaning age, it depends on region, it depends on disease state and the coverage environment outside of a trial for your technology. We can help you evaluate that depending on your specifics.
Very nice. Next question. We did not have PAP in place during our trial, but could we bill for revision surgeries for data purposes in the meantime?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. We did not have PAP or PAP in place during our trial, but could we bill for revision surgeries for data purposes in the meantime?
So I don't have all the specifics, but so it sounds like, okay, and Alicia, I'm curious what you think, but you mentioned they didn't use a patient access program. I'm wondering if they asked their sites to bill for the index surgery though. That's the piece I'm not sure on. You know, I think in general, even if a sponsor pays for a surgery, if there is a complication following that surgery, most health plans will allow you to bill for that, depending on if it is research related or not. So if a device caused a complication and a revision surgery was needed, that is very often something the sponsor pays for directly. But if it's, you know, something indicative of like the natural progression of the disease, that's something that is very often appropriate to bill. So again, it depends. Sorry, I hear myself. It does depend though.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Daria. It's case by case, right? So that's how we look at it in at least from a patient access perspective. It's always going to be case by case. Each case is unique. It's different, especially when you're dealing with new and novel technologies. Just hard to say, but that's a good question.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we have our last question. Thanks both for the presentation. What would you say are the most important data points for the patient access program to collect during a clinical trial?
You want to take a step first?
No, you go first. You go first.
I mean, first and foremost, you know, the code behavior against the payer, understanding your approvals versus your denials, looking deeply at not only being happy that you get the approvals, but really taking the denial information in as an opportunity to either strengthen your evidence arsenal, you know, or your actual payer engagement or stakeholder engagement strategies. Denials are not all bad. They actually give us a peek into where we need to strengthen the overall reimbursement strategy, and payers specifically where we need to focus. So collecting those data points are important. Utilization, regional data. So from a trial perspective, understanding which trial sites are actually, you know, submitting cases and using the program so that you can see the outcome of those claims and follow that story, and understanding where you may need your field staff to sort of push, you know, harder on sites to utilize the program to help, you know, understand the behavior of the technology and or the payers. You know, we can collect, you know, patient information from the protecting PHI, of course, but, age, high-level diagnoses, just utilization at its finest. So the more data that we collect for the program, the richer the program becomes, because alternatively that data can be used down the line to help you in other areas within your market and reimbursement strategies. Daria, did I miss anything from a clinical trial
well
perspective?
said. No, absolutely agree.
Brilliant. I don't think we have any more questions. So just to close off today's webinar, I'd like to say, firstly, thank you very much to Daria and Alicia. And thank you to all of you who have joined us for today's webinar. And of course, a huge thank you to the MICRA team for sharing their expertise. We will be, just to reaffirm, we will be releasing the slides to all the attendees, and I'm sure the team are happy to discuss the content or any questions about today's presentation and any other extra ways they can help you or your business after the webinar. We will be sending a follow-up email to all of you who are registered as soon as possible, which we will include a link to the full recorded webinar. And just lastly, I'd like to say thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon at our next installment of our webinar series. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.